Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, double San Remo. I'll be taking a deep dive into both races, as well as taking a detailed look at the speeds that the men went up the Cipressa and Poggio. Just how much different were they than last year? This week in the world of racing, we learnt that a sub-9-minute ascent of the Cipressa is possible. So according to Strava, Pogačar climbed it in 8 minutes 59 seconds at Milan San Remo on Saturday, giving him an average speed up there of 37.6 kilometres per hour. I'll be taking a deep dive into the stats of that race very shortly. We also learnt that the Tour de France, both men's and women's, is coming to the UK in 2027. ASO made the news official last week, so the men's race is going to start in Edinburgh, with Stage 2 in Wales and Stage 3 in England, whilst the women's is rumoured to be starting in Yorkshire. The other good news was that ASO said they were confident that the UK-based stages would be available to watch free to view. Here's hoping. And finally, we learnt, or were reminded, that Milan San Remo can produce the most exciting racing of the year. There's such a divide amongst cycling fans as to how good or bad that race is, but surely there wasn't anyone who wasn't on the edge of their seat for the finale of the men's race on Saturday. Now, I personally never thought that I'd see a race-winning move come on the Cipressa in my days of watching this race. There has been lots of talk about it, lots of speculation, but on Saturday, it actually happened. Perhaps not with the winner that many would have expected in that scenario, though. I am, of course, talking about Tadej Pogačar, back at the race for the 5th time in his career and gunning for that elusive victory. Now, unlike last year, they didn't push the pace UAE on the Tre Capi that preceded Cipressa, presumably with the idea of saving more teammates to light things up on that longer climb. But that didn't really go to plan. The run into the Cipressa is just so hectic, it's really hard to get all of your teammates in the right place at the right time. So as it was, only Wellens was at the front there, and even Pogačar himself didn't enter that climb in the top 10. Regardless, Wellens pressed on at a ferocious pace, so the plan there was quite obvious. The pace was so fierce, though, that Jonathan Narvaez struggled to get to the front, and he actually still wasn't there by the time the Belgian was done with his turn. And Narvaez got there eventually, though, and he punched out of a few corners at warp speed, and it wasn't long before we saw the inevitable Poggio attack. The bad news for him, though, was that two of the other big favourites for the day were right on his wheel, Ganna and Van der Poel. Romain Gregoire of Groupama FDJ was also there, briefly, clinging on for dear life as if a bomb had exploded in front of him, but it wasn't long before we had 3 Galacticos trading blows at the front of that race. Or at least trying to dodge the jabs that Pogačar was throwing continuously at them. Ganna rode his own pace, which initially was perfect for Mathieu van der Poel. He didn't have to respond to Pogačar's accelerations because the Italian was doing it for him. Given what we know now, though, you can only assume that he felt confident he could jump across at any point, should Ganna tire. Which he did, at a point. He had the chase of his life for what seemed like most of the last 25 kilometres of the race on Saturday. Anyway, over the top of the Cipressa, the race was already over for everybody else, the next group already trailing by over half a minute there. Now, before I move on to the rest of Milan San Remo men's, it's worth looking at the times, I think, up the Cipressa. So Pogačar and Ganna both uploaded their files, and the data shows that they flew up that climb, almost half a minute quicker than Luke Platt from last year, who'd taken the King of the Mountains there. However, you have to then go down to 38th place on that overall leaderboard to find the next rider from this year's race. And now you'd assume that's because Wellens' pace at the start of the Cipressa was so fierce and so fast, it put everyone deep into the red, and they then paid for that the rest of the way up that climb. However, if you look at this comparison, I'd say it suggests otherwise. So Pogačar, Plapp and Filippo Zanna are all pretty much locked together until the exact point that Pogačar makes his first attack. Zanna this year and Plapp last continue to ride at quite a similar pace for the next K&a-half, and it's only in the last K&a-half of the climb that the group Zanna was in this year seemed to slow. I guess without Ineos, UAE or Alpecin to work behind, there probably just wasn't anyone left that was able to set a really high pace there. Anyway, at the front of the race, the three of them worked very well together, which I was fairly surprised about. Van der Poel and Ganna must both have known they were going to be exposed to 100 attacks from Pogačar up the Poggio, and so it seemed a little unnecessary, at the very least for Filippo Ganna of the Ineos Grenadiers, who'd clearly been suffering the most. What was even more surprising was that Tadej Pogačar was allowed to start the Poggio, the last climb of the race, in third wheel of the three. I mean, he must have been in disbelief himself at that point in the race. He did at least allow about 5 seconds of the climb before making his first move on it. Van der Poel was straight on his wheel. Ganna was straight back into chasing mode. And I have to give it to Pogačar though. He dug as deep on that climb as I've seen him dig pretty much in any other race. You can't say that he didn't try, but whatever he threw at Mathieu van der Poel, the Dutchman was able to respond to. And he even countered the world champion near the top of the climb, but Pogačar got back on and the two of them started the descent with around 8 seconds in hand over Ganna. Again, quite interesting I'd say to look at the Strava results up that climb. So Pogačar actually set a new KOM for the first half of the Poggio, and when you compare it to his time up there last year, most of the gain came in the first kilometre, where he went 9 seconds quicker than 12 months before. He does end up paying for all his efforts though, and so by the top, he's 14 seconds slower than last year. Impressive nonetheless though, given how differently the two races panned out. So Pogačar rides on the front for most of the descent, but what I was surprised about was that he took equal pulls with Van der Poel once they hit the flat at the bottom. I felt like that was his chance to say, okay, we're on your favoured terrain now. If you don't want Ganna coming back, then it's up to you to ride and keep him behind. That's probably not in Pogačar's vocabulary though, is it? Ganna did eventually come back, but by that point it was so late and he'd done so much chasing, he wasn't going to have much left to sprint. Pogačar allowed him through to second wheel and then left a gap to run into for the sprint. But unfortunately for him, Van der Poel kicked the line just as he'd left that gap. And the rest, as they say, is history. Van der Poel did a reasonably long sprint, Ganna couldn't get on terms with him, and Pogačar couldn't get on terms with Ganna. My word though, what a race. That was everything you could possibly want from any one-day classic, so chapeau to all three of them. For Van der Poel, it's his second win at Milan San Remo, so he's the first rider to do that since Oscar Freire. It's also the third win in a row for Alpecin de Koning, and it's the first time that's happened since the early 70s. So Van der Poel now has 7 monuments in his increasingly impressive palmares. The old duel with Wout van Aert just isn't really a thing anymore, with the Belgian stuck on the one win in San Remo back in 2020. So the real duel is between Van der Poel and Pogačar, two very different riders who converge on the day of Milan San Remo and Flanders each year. Pogačar too has 7 monuments to his name, and the two will resume that rivalry at E3 this Friday, then at Flanders 9 days after that, and possibly at Paris-Roubaix after that as well. If, or more likely when, one of them adds to their monument tally this spring, they're going to surpass the likes of Cancellara and Bonen and draw level with Rick van Looy. And should either of them take 2, they'll equal Sean Kelly, Fausto Coppi and Constante Girardengo, who have 9 apiece. Only Roger de Vlaeminck and Eddy Merckx have 1 more. So whatever your opinion on whether their dominance is boring, and I think it's a hard argument to make based on Saturday's race, we are certainly witnessing greatness. Now, their record in the monuments that they didn't win is almost as impressive as those that they did. So Van der Poel has now started 19, and he's only finished outside the top 10 once. That was at Milan San Remo in 2020. And on top of his 7 wins, he's finished a further 5 times on the podium. Pogačar, meanwhile, has started 16 monuments and twice finished outside the top 10. Those were at the first 2 that he started, though. 18th at Liège in 2019 as a neo-pro, 12th at Milan San Remo the year after. Since then, he hasn't finished outside the top 5, although he did abandon Liège after that crash in 2023. Now, in his last 6 starts, he's won 4 and finished 3rd in the other 2. And given that 6 of Mathieu van der Poel's 7 monument wins have come when he was older than Pogačar is now, it's a scary prospect to think of the tally the Slovenian can accumulate if he continues his current form and motivation into his early 30s. I'd love to know what you think, though. Are you bored of seeing the same riders winning all the time? Did Saturday's race change your opinion on that? You can let me know in the comment section just down below. Right, I should probably go through the results before I move on to the women's race. Outside of that top 3, there was another very solid ride from Michael Matthews of Jayco Alula. He finished 4th, and that was his 7th top 10 at the race. A great ride from Caden Groves saw him take 5th in his debut at the race. Magnus Cort took his best ever result at a monument in 6th, just ahead of compatriot Mads Pedersen, and then it was Coy, Trentin and Wright. OK, on to the women's race now, and it's hard to do the same stats when it comes to monuments in women's racing. There are other races, like the Trofeo Alfredo Binda, that have a far longer history than the likes of Liège, Roubaix and obviously Milan San Remo. But it doesn't really matter what classification you give those one-day races. I think you'll all agree that it's great to have a women's San Remo on the same day as the men's. Of all the races on the calendar, it's the one that most suits being on the same day, because whichever race comes first, you know you're not going to be missing anything in the other one, because nothing happens until at least the Tre Capi. There was action on the Capi in the women's race, but not the sort that you want to see. A couple of crashes there, the most notable being the one caused by Letizia Paternoster of Liverlula Jaco. Now, it was quite hard to see exactly what happened to her, beyond losing balance. Unfortunately though, it was so long before she hit the deck that she acted like a bowling ball into pins, taking down a huge number of riders with her. Marianne Vos and Pauline Ferrand-Prévot were amongst those affected, but both quickly got back in contention. So going into the Cipressa, SD Works were brilliant. Marta Lack took a very cool, calm and collected looking Lotte Kopecky into the base of it at the front, with Blanca Vash and Lorena Vibes just behind her. It wasn't SD Works though who pushed the pace on the climb itself. UAE ADQ were the first to go with Erica Magnaldi, and then FDJ Suez took over with Luce Adagist. Lidl Trek for a little while too, but then with 2Ks to the top, the pace seemed to drop. Lidl continued to set the pace that they wanted for Balsamo, but we didn't see a single attack there, and the group was at least 40 strong when they went over the top, which I was surprised about. I mean, the Cipressa is the hardest climb in the race, and I was fully expecting FDJ to light it up for Vollering, even if that was just to soften the legs of the others and not for a full-blown attack from the Dutch woman. Pauline Ferrand-Prévot set the pace pretty much all the way down the descent of the Cipressa, and it did cause a split. Unfortunately though, she only served to pull a group clear that didn't contain any of her teammates, including Vos, but did include 3 riders from SD Works, 2 from Lidl Trek, 2 from Canyon SRAM, plus the likes of Longo Borghini and Puk Pizza. Now from what we saw, Vos didn't do any of the chasing herself in the group behind, but it wasn't ideal. Thankfully for her, there wasn't much cohesion in that front group, and it came back together midway between the 2 final climbs. And then on the Poggio, Cecily Uttrup Ludwig of Canyon SRAM's Zonda Crypto was the first to really up the pace significantly, and it was her on the front for the vast majority of that climb. Now, it was a pace that must have been high enough to deter attacks, but then not high enough to drop that many riders. There were still around 30 in the front group with 1K to the top. Now, when an attack did come there, it definitely wasn't from the rider I was expecting to make it, French champion Juliette Labou. Now, I think we were all expecting that team to be setting up Vollering for a really big attack, but she was about 15 wheels back when Labou went. Nuvia Doma and Lecour both tried to get clear after that, and then came Vollering. Now, the trouble was that when Vollering hit the front, there was about 5 metres to go until the left-hand turn that signals the start of the descent. Now, in her post-race interview, Vollering said she wasn't at her best on the day, but also that she'd got caught out of position and was also surprised by the sheer speed they went up the climbs. Which I think is understandable, because until you do those races, it's really hard to know what it's going to be like in racing conditions. And so whilst the men have years of riding it themselves and decades of previous examples, it's pretty much brand new for the women. I've almost no doubt that we'll see a very different race pan out this time next year. It wasn't what I was expecting though, I must admit. I thought that more rides would be dropped on the Cipressa, making it easier to make a difference up the Poggio. As it was on the day, we had about 15 riders that went over the top of the Poggio together, and with both Kopecky and Vibes there for SD Works, the final result was almost inevitable. Very easy to say that in hindsight, of course, and Elisa Longo Borghini of UAE did come close to rewriting that script. So the Italian champion put in a big attack just as they hit the foot of the descent, and she was a little unlucky that Puk Pizza spent quite some time chasing behind her, Vollering for a little while there as well. And that meant that Kopecky's job was just that little bit easier once she came to the front. Longo Borghini put up a great fight, but she was caught almost inside of the line. So in the sprint, Vos went first, and from the head-on shot, it looked fairly close between her and Vives, but on the overhead one, you can see the clear difference in speed between the two. So, a huge win for Vives and a huge win for SD Worx, who played it perfectly the whole day. And that really is one of the big advantages of having both a sprinter and an attacker in the same team, isn't it? Not only do you have all bases covered, but your rivals also don't know what your plan is. Vos's longevity continues to amaze. She should be proud of second. As should Naomi Rugg in third for EF. That was a brilliant ride by her. With Ferrand-Prévot relegated for deviating in the sprint, which I thought was a bit harsh from what I saw, Vollering ended up taking fourth. But I'd say the most disappointed rider in the top 10 was probably Balsamo in seventh for Lidl Trek. On her day, she'd be much closer to a win in a sprint like that, I'd say. Okay, just before I move on, another nod to the GCN Shop. We've been promoting the Italian-inspired Classics t-shirts for the last couple of weeks, but as the Cobble Classics are now looming, it seems like an appropriate time to point you towards those ones as well. You can see the full collection if you head over to shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com, and I'll put a link to that in the description just down below this video. Right, on to some other races now, as there were quite a few one-days that took place in Northern Europe last week. I'll start with the Grand Prix d'Hénin, which incorporates a few sections of pavé that are also used at Paris-Roubaix. The win there for Matt Brennan was very, very impressive. He made a front selection of riders, most of whom are far more experienced than he is, but he did everything right. He didn't let any dangerous moves go clear, he was clever when he needed to be, and he positioned himself perfectly for the final sprint to the line. He's only 19, so to have already taken his first pro win for Visma Leasebike and getting the better of Gianni Vermeersch and Dries de Bont in the process is very, very impressive indeed. They're both incredibly strong riders. At the Bredene Coxeder Classic, Ed Turns took an equally impressive win. That race was run off at an average speed of over 47 kilometres per hour, and the front group containing Turns spent almost the entire day less than a minute in front of the chasing peloton. They were caught actually, but that catch came so late the sprinters behind were never really in a position to win the race. Turns went early, probably too early, but he had the speed to hold off Luc Lamperti of Soudal Quickstep and Niels Elkoff of Picnic Post-Nel to the line. Elkoff himself actually had taken a win the previous day at Knocker Course on what was a revised finish. The redesign at that race was to make the run-in safer, and I think it was, but there was still a crash in the finale. Jasper Philipsen came down hardest and was transported to the finish line in an ambulance. He was flying there too, so here's hoping it doesn't affect his Cobble Classics campaign. In the women's Knocker course, Marta Lack took her first win for SD Worx, out-sprinting Linda Zanetti and Lara Gillespie. Isaac Del Toro took the biggest win of his career at Milano Torino last Wednesday, and did so in such a mature way, I would say. Teammate Adam Yates set him up for an attack on the climb to the finish, but he wasn't able to distance Ben Tulett and Tobias Johannesson. However, he stayed calm, used Tulett to chase down a late attack by Johannesson, and then easily had enough to accelerate to the win at the end. And just finally, there was a great win for Unibet Tietema Rocket at the Cholet Aglo Tour. Lucas Kubish outsprinted Benjamin Thomas and Nicholas Larsen to take the biggest win of his career so far. Right, I think that just about wraps things up for another week on the Racing News Show. There's a big week of racing coming though. The Volta Catalunya kicks off today, and without Vingegaard and Pogačar, it's looking fairly open. Plus there's E3 on Friday and Gent-Wevelgem men's and women's on Sunday. A reminder, you can watch a full season of bike racing live on Discovery Plus and Max. I'll be back next Monday to wrap up all of those races, so I look forward to having your company again then.